Franklin Moore was the beloved pastor of a small Missouri town until he vanished the same night his church burned to the ground in 1987. 14 years later, construction workers found a sealed basement beneath the ruins, revealing 5 victims, a restraint chair, and a journal filled with twisted justifications. What Moore left behind wasn't just a mystery. It was a hidden history of ritualistic murder buried in the heart of the community that trusted him most, in a quiet Missouri town nestled between cornfields and aging highways. The First Light Baptist Church had long stood as a symbol of faith and community. Its white steeple and faded brick walls had seen generations come and go, from baptisms to funerals, Sunday potlucks to midnight prayers. Built in 1949, the church was more than just a building. It was where people found purpose, comfort, and belonging. For nearly 4 decades, it served as the town's anchor, and no figure was more central to it than Pastor Franklin Moore. With his stern face and calm voice, he had led services every Sunday without fail, never missing a sermon, a wedding, or a visit to a sick parishioner. People trusted him with their sins, their secrets, and their children. That on the night of February 12, 1987, a thick plume of smoke rose above Maple Ridge just before midnight. By the time firefighters arrived, the First Light Baptist Church was already consumed by flames. The fire moved fast, licking up the walls and collapsing the roof in a matter of minutes. Embers danced in the air like fireflies as ash rained down on the frozen ground. It took 4 fire engines and more than 3 hours to control the blaze. But by sunrise, the church was gone, reduced to blackened timbers and crumbling stone. Local newspapers called it an electrical accident. Investigators concluded that faulty wiring in the attic had sparked the fire. Though no official maintenance records were ever located, the town mourned. Photos of the fire ran in the local press for days. Parishioners gathered in the school auditorium the following Sunday to pray and share memories. The loss was personal. Children cried as they passed the smoldering ruins. Elderly couples stood silently by the fence, holding hands and staring at the black skeleton that remained. But what struck some people as odd was not just the speed of the fire. It was what happened afterward. Pastor Franklin Moore, a man who had spent his life devoted to the church, disappeared. At first, no one noticed. It was assumed he was grieving, possibly staying with relatives. But as the week wore on, concern turned into confusion. His car was gone. His small house next to the church, known as the parsonage, had been emptied out. Drawers were cleaned, clothes removed, and the bed neatly made. His name was quietly removed from town records, and no public statement was ever given by the church board. By the following month, a new interim pastor was announced. The rebuilding effort was launched. Funds from the insurance claim were quickly secured, and construction began on a smaller chapel just a mile away. Some townspeople whispered questions behind closed doors. Why would a man of faith vanish without saying goodbye? Why had there been no funeral for the church building itself? No memorial, no formal farewell from its longtime leader? Rumors emerged. Some said he'd had a nervous breakdown. Others believed he'd gone on a spiritual retreat. A few more cynical voices suggested he had run away with money, or something worse. But no one asked too loudly. In a town built on politeness and tradition, silence was easier than scandal. As the new church rose from the ashes, the memory of the fire slowly faded. People moved on. Life continued. The ruins of the original First Light Baptist Church, however, remained untouched. Though the town could have demolished them, no one ever did. The foundation sat fenced off, overtaken by weeds and ivy. On windy nights, some claimed to hear strange sounds from within the ruins, metal groaning, wood creaking, whispers riding the breeze. But those stories were dismissed as superstition. After all, the fire had been an accident. The pastor had moved away, and that was the end of it. Or so everyone thought. For 14 years, the charred remains of the First Light Baptist Church stood untouched. The site, once sacred and full of life, had become a forgotten ruin at the edge of town. Wild vines crept along the crumbling brickwork, and tall grass choked the perimeter. Rusting pieces of metal, bent window frames, scorched nails, scraps of roofing, lay scattered in the soil like forgotten relics. The old church sign, blackened but still standing, leaned sideways on a rusted post, its faded lettering barely legible. All are welcome. Over time, the community stopped noticing it. Children dared each other to sneak in through the broken gate. Teenagers made up ghost stories. But adults walked past without looking, as if the entire place had been swallowed. By time that in the spring of 2001, the town council approved a plan to convert the empty lot into a community center. It was meant to be a fresh start, something practical to replace the haunted memory of what once stood there. Demolition crews were brought in to begin clearing the site. On a warm morning in early May, the first backhoe rolled across the cracked pavement and began tearing into the foundation. Bricks fell easily, crumbling under pressure, revealing layers of scorched wood and ash beneath. It seemed like routine work until the machine struck something solid, too solid to be rubble. The operator stopped. What had been uncovered was a thick, reinforced slab of concrete, far deeper than expected and completely out of place. At its center, a rusted metal ring was bolted into what looked like a sealed hatch. Authorities were called. At first, they believed it might be an old storm shelter or a maintenance access point. But as they cleared more debris away, it became clear this structure had been intentionally hidden. The hatch was locked from the outside, the bolts sealed over with layers of mortar. It took several hours for the team to force it open. When the door finally gave way, a gust of stale, cold air rushed upward from the darkness below. A narrow staircase led into a subterranean chamber. Flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air like tiny stars. The walls were concrete, rough, and undecorated. At the bottom of the steps was a heavy wooden door that had swollen with moisture. When it was pried open, what the investigators saw stunned them. The room stretched about 20 feet across, filled with old furniture covered in mold and decay. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and broken shelves leaned precariously in corners. But in the center of the room stood something deeply unsettling, a wooden chair, firmly bolted to the floor. Leather straps were attached to the arms and legs of the chair, brittle from age but still clearly intact. The image was unmistakable. It was a restraint device. Around the chair, the floor was stained with dark patches, too faded to identify immediately. The air carried a heavy, musty odor, mixed with something more metallic. On a nearby table were old tools, wires, and rolls of duct tape. In one cabinet, someone found a small stack of cassette tapes, each labeled with handwritten dates. Some were from as early as 1974. Others were marked just months before the fire in 1987. There was also a dusty leather-bound book tucked beneath the tapes. Its spine was cracked, but inside were pages of tightly written entries, most signed with a single name, Franklin Moore. Investigators stepped back, stunned at the discovery. What had initially seemed like a routine construction project had become something else entirely. The hidden room raised more questions than answers. Why had it been sealed beneath a church? Why had no one known it was there? And what exactly had Pastor Moore been doing in that underground space? The answers, it seemed, were buried in the tapes, the journal, and the concrete walls of a secret chamber that had been hidden for decades, until now. The contents of the hidden basement were sent immediately to a state forensic lab. Specialists handled the journal and cassette tapes with extreme care, understanding that whatever secrets they held had remained buried for over a decade. It took days to clean and catalog the materials. Most of the tapes had degraded from age and moisture, but several remained intact. Investigators listened in silence as the first recordings played. The audio was murky, filled with background hum and occasional mechanical clicks, but the content was chilling. On some tapes, a voice, calm and measured, was heard reciting scripture. Then came moments of silence, followed by distressed breathing, soft crying, or the dragging of what sounded like chains. At least one tape captured what could only be described as a plea for mercy, muffled and cut short. Another recording ended with a loud thud and the scraping of something heavy across the floor. The voice on the tapes was identified quickly. It matched old sermons still archived by the town's radio station. It was Franklin Moore. The journal confirmed the worst. Page after page, Moore documented what he called spiritual interventions. He wrote about individuals he believed were consumed by sin and how he felt called by God to correct them. The entries were clinical and cold. He referred to his subjects by number. Subject 3 refused confession. Subject 4 needed more time. Subject 5, according to the journal, resisted completely and displayed signs of possession. Moore described sessions that lasted for hours, sometimes days. He noted restraints, recitations, and prayers conducted while the subjects were tied to the chair in the basement. No names were ever listed, just dates and behaviors. His tone never changed. He seemed to believe he was performing holy work. In one particular entry dated October 1986, Moore wrote about hearing the voice of God telling him that darkness had entered his church. He described dreams filled with fire and warnings. He believed the fire that eventually consumed the building would be a form of divine punishment, not for him, but for those who had failed to understand his purpose. He made no mention of plans to leave town, but he did mention a final cleansing that would come before winter. That entry, oddly enough, was the last one written. Investigators returned to the site and began a deeper search of the basement. A forensic team brought in ground-penetrating radar. What they found next shifted the case from disturbing to horrific. Behind one of the concrete walls was a hollow space, and inside it, carefully arranged, were bone fragments, human remains. Over the course of several days, they uncovered 5 separate burial spots, each marked by thin layers of dirt and lime. Most of the remains were partial. Some had been dismembered. One set, discovered closest to the restraining chair, still had a wrist shackle attached to the bone. DNA testing would later identify 2 of the victims. A 16-year-old girl who disappeared after a church retreat in 1982, and a local drifter, last seen volunteering at the church in 1985. The other remains were too degraded to match. There were no dental records, no known relatives. But the evidence painted a gruesome picture. Pastor Franklin Moore had not simply gone mad in the final days before the fire. He had been conducting what he believed were religious punishments for over a decade. No one had suspected him. No one had looked deeper as the truth unfolded. Maple Ridge began to reckon with the fact that their trusted spiritual leader had committed a series of ritualistic murders under the town's nose. What they had believed to be an accident in 1987 was starting to look more like a cover-up. Whether the fire had been intentional was still uncertain, but what was now clear was that it had successfully hidden something vile, and it had taken 14 years for anyone to find it. The discovery of human remains beneath the church sent shockwaves through Maple Ridge. For years, the town had honored Pastor Franklin Moore as a spiritual figure, a man who had served faithfully for decades. Now, that legacy was unraveling into something monstrous. The basement beneath the old church was no longer just a curiosity, it was a crime scene. Police sealed off the entire site, and forensic experts from the state arrived to take over the investigation. What had started as a construction project had turned into one of Missouri's most disturbing cold cases. Search teams began examining every inch of the hidden chamber. Behind the crumbling walls, they found traces of more blood, most too old to test. Scattered among the debris were torn bits of fabric, strands of hair, and more tools, pliers, wires, belts, all covered in rust and rot. Each item was bagged and labeled, but the implications were clear. The space had been used not just for confinement, but for prolonged suffering. Based on the journal entries and the spacing of the burial sites, experts believe the killings took place over a span of at least 10 years. More disturbing still were the documents found inside the filing cabinets. Dozens of handwritten letters were tucked into unmarked envelopes, many never mailed. The letters were filled with spiritual reflections, personal confessions, and what appeared to be drafts of sermons. At first glance, they seemed harmless, but closer inspection revealed patterns. Certain phrases repeated across multiple documents: divine obedience, flesh must be silenced, submission through suffering. Each letter, in some way, justified violence in religious terms. Some were addressed to no one. Others were marked, for the record. One of the most chilling discoveries came from a hidden compartment at the base of a cabinet. Behind a false panel, investigators found a reel of undeveloped film wrapped tightly in wax paper. It was sent to a lab and processed under careful supervision. What developed were 10 black and white photographs. The grainy images showed the chair in the basement, always from the same angle, always with a different person restrained. The faces were blurred or turned away, but the body language told the story. Some were slumped. Others were visibly struggling. In several photos, Pastor Moore could be seen standing behind them, holding a Bible, when the images were shown to surviving family members of past churchgoers. One woman recognized a pattern on a shirt. It had belonged to her brother, who had gone missing in 1981. He had been part of the church youth group. She had always believed he had run away. Now, she realized he may have never left the building. News spread quickly. National outlets picked up the story, dubbing Moore the basement pastor. Journalists and true crime enthusiasts flooded Maple Ridge, eager to understand how something so horrific could happen in a place so small and quiet. The town, once proud of its history, now carried a heavy shadow. Older residents felt betrayed. Younger ones were horrified by the secret legacy of the church their parents had once trusted. Despite the overwhelming evidence, one question still lingered: what exactly caused the fire in 1987? Investigators returned to the official fire report and found inconsistencies. The wiring had never been inspected. The cause was listed as likely electrical, with no photos or lab analysis included. It seemed the conclusion had been accepted far too easily that a new theory emerged, that the fire had been set intentionally. Perhaps Moore had feared exposure. Perhaps someone else had discovered the basement and wanted to silence him. But no evidence surfaced to prove it. What they didn't know was this: after the last entry in the journal, no new tape recordings were made. No new bodies were buried. The fire had put an end to something. Whether that end was chosen by Moore himself or forced by someone else remained a mystery. For Maple Ridge, the truth was enough to reopen old wounds. Generations who had worshipped under Moore's guidance were now questioning everything. Faith had been twisted into cruelty, and the church that once brought light had, in its final years, become a place of darkness. With the full scope of the horror now unearthed, authorities turned their attention to the question that had haunted the town for years: what happened to Pastor Franklin Moore? His sudden disappearance following the fire had always seemed strange, but now, in light of the murders, it looked more like an escape. Investigators dug through old records, hoping for any clue. They reviewed bank statements, real estate transactions, phone logs, anything tied to his identity. For a while, it seemed like Moore had vanished without a trace. But then they found it. A bank record dated 2 days before the fire revealed a large withdrawal from the church's emergency fund, $27,000, a massive sum for a small-town church in 1987. That money had been quietly transferred to a personal account under the name Frank Morris, a known alias Moore had used once for a church retreat years earlier. The account remained dormant until a real estate transaction surfaced. A small, isolated property purchased in the Nevada desert in early 1988, listed under the same alias. It was registered to a P.O. box and paid for in cash. Detectives traveled to Nevada and located the land, a barren stretch near the edge of a dried-up canyon. At the center stood a crumbling shack made of corrugated steel and weather-worn wood. Inside, they found remnants of someone who had lived there for years. There was a cot, a lantern, a Bible with tattered pages, and a shelf filled with old canned food. A small desk held a box of newspaper clippings, most yellowed and brittle, about the fire at First Light Baptist Church. One photo showed the building engulfed in flames, circled in red ink. Another article was about the missing pastor. Tucked behind the frame of a mirror was a photograph of the original church, the steeple still intact, taken from across the street. Scrawled on the back in faded ink was the phrase, "The light is gone. The judgment is complete." Neighbors recalled an older man who kept to himself, introduced only as Mr. Morris. He had died 3 years earlier of natural causes, buried in an unmarked grave in a small-town cemetery a few miles away. When authorities exhumed the body, dental records confirmed what many feared. Franklin Moore had escaped justice and lived out his final years in solitude. He had buried the truth, literally and figuratively, and left Maple Ridge behind as if it were nothing more than a bad dream. Back in Missouri, the town struggled to process the revelations. The new First Light Chapel, built just after the fire, removed Moore's photo from the wall. His name was stripped from the cornerstone and erased from official documents. The memorial garden behind the new church was rededicated to the victims, whose remains had now been properly identified and buried. Only 3 names were confirmed, but 5 white crosses were placed in their honor.